She was delivered to the wrong man's door, and the right man didn't know what to do with her. Rowan Hale had traveled 400 miles on a promise, a name written on a piece of paper, and the stubborn belief that a woman could build something real out of almost nothing. What she got instead was a stranger's porch, a stranger's silence, and a sky so wide and indifferent it made her feel like a mistake the land hadn't bothered to correct yet. The stagecoach was already gone. The next one wouldn't come for days. And the man standing in the doorway of this isolated Dakota homestead looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't asked for. Because she was. Stay with her. Because what happens next will change everything you think you know about where a person truly belongs. If this story moves you, press like and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. The stage driver hadn't even slowed down properly. Rowan remembered that part clearly. The way the brake had ground against the wheel with a sound like something complaining. The way her trunk had slid forward and knocked against her knees, and the way the driver had called out the name Hale Junction with the flat confidence of a man who had never once been wrong in his life. She'd gathered her bag, stepped down into the dust, and by the time she turned around to ask if someone would help with the trunk, the stage was already 30 yards down the road and pulling away. She'd stood there for a moment with the prairie wind pushing at her coat and looked at what was supposed to be the beginning of her arranged life. It was a ranch. That much was right. There were fields, fences, a barn that had seen better decades, a water trough that had cracked along one side and been repaired badly with tar pitch. There was a house, 2 stories, weathered gray, the kind of gray that comes not from paint but from years of sun and wind stripping away whatever dignity the wood once had. There was a man standing near the fence line watching her. He wasn't Gideon Cross. She knew that immediately, though she'd never met Gideon Cross either. She had a letter with a physical description. Tall, clean-shaven, broad shoulders, usually wearing a gray vest. And this man didn't match any of it. He was tall enough, but his jaw carried 3 or 4 days of growth. His shirt was rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and he was watching her with an expression that was less welcome and more what in the world. Rowan looked at the piece of paper in her hand, then at the house, then at the man. "Is this the Cross property?" she called out. He walked toward her slowly, the way a person walks when they already suspect the answer to the question they haven't asked yet. He had a deliberate kind of movement to him. Not lazy, just unhurried, like a man who'd learned long ago that rushing rarely changed outcomes. "No," he said. "Cross property is 12 miles east. You're on Boone land." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when 2 people simultaneously calculate exactly how bad a situation is. "The driver said Hale Junction," Rowan said, mostly to herself. "He dropped you at Boone Crossing." The man, Boone, apparently, looked at her trunk, then at the road, which was empty in both directions for as far as the eye could follow. "Next stage comes through in 4 days." 4 days. Rowan set her bag down on top of her trunk with a controlled, deliberate motion. She was 23 years old, she had $41 and some change in her coat pocket, and she was standing on a stranger's property in Dakota Territory in late October with the temperature already dropping towards something unpleasant and nowhere else in the world to be. "I'm Rowan Hale," she said. "Silas Boone." He said it the way a man gives his name when he's not sure why he's bothering. Not rude exactly. More like a person who'd spent so long talking to very few people that ordinary social machinery had gone a little rusty. "I need somewhere to stay until the stage comes back through," Rowan said. She didn't make it a question because she'd learned early that questions invite refusals in a way that direct statements sometimes don't. "I can work for room and board. I'm not asking for charity." Silas looked at her for a moment. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of dry grass and coming cold. "You cook?" he asked. "Yes." "Can you do anything else?" She almost smiled. "You'll have to wait and see." He gave her the smaller of the 2 upstairs rooms, the one that faced east and got the morning light. It had a cot, a washstand, a window that didn't quite close all the way along the bottom edge, and a braided rug that had been worn thin in the center. She'd slept in worse. That first evening, she made supper from what she found in the kitchen, a pot of beans with salt pork, cornbread from a bag of meals she found near the back of the pantry. The kitchen itself was a study in functional neglect. Everything worked technically, but the flour had been stored next to the onions and absorbed a faint bitterness, The cast iron skillet had a rim of old grease baked into the handle that no one had scraped off in months, and whoever was doing the cooking before her arrival had been keeping the fire too high and scorching the bottom of everything. She didn't say any of that. She cleaned the skillet handle while the beans simmered and moved the flour to the shelf above the window. There were two of them at supper, Silas and his grandfather, an old man named Calhoun, who came down the stairs moving carefully and sat himself at the table with the ease of someone who had earned his right to take his time. He had white hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that were a pale, sharp blue that made him look younger than the rest of him. He looked at Rowan with something that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite suspicion, more like assessment. "You ride?" the old man asked her before she'd even sat down. "Some," she said. "What kind of some?" "Enough to get somewhere. Not enough to look good doing it." Calhoun made a short sound that might have been a laugh. Silas said nothing, which Rowan was already beginning to understand was his default response to most things. They ate without much conversation. The beans were decent. The cornbread was better than decent, and she saw Silas take a second piece without comment, which she counted as a kind of compliment. After supper, Calhoun lingered at the table with his coffee, while Silas went back outside to finish something in the barn. The old man watched her clear the dishes with those pale blue eyes, and there was something in his attention that felt less like scrutiny and more like recognition, like someone identifying a thing they'd seen before but hadn't expected to see here. "How'd a woman like you end up being shipped out for an arranged marriage?" he asked. It wasn't unkind. It was just a direct question from a man who seemed to have decided she could handle directness. "Practical decision," she said. "I grew up in Ohio. My father's land went to my brother when he died. I had training in household management, some knowledge of farming, and no particular prospects where I was. The arrangement with Mr. Cross came through a placement service. It seemed like a reasonable solution, but not something you particularly wanted." Rowan set the dish down and looked at him. "Wanting things is a luxury I haven't spent a lot of time on." Calhoun turned his coffee cup in his hands. He said, which could have meant anything. She finished the dishes and went to bed early because there was nothing else to do, and she was tired in the particular bone-deep way of someone who has been traveling for 3 days and managing anxiety about the future for considerably longer. She lay on the cot in the east-facing room and listened to the wind outside and tried to think practically about what came next. 4 days. She would stay 4 days, work for her keep, take the stage to the Cross property, and proceed with the arrangement as planned. That was the only sensible course. She had a commitment. She had an agreement. She was not the kind of person who abandoned agreement simply because a stagecoach driver couldn't read a route card. She fell asleep with that resolution firmly in mind and woke up before dawn feeling restless in a way she couldn't name. The second morning, she found the irrigation problem. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been up early, earlier than anyone else, apparently, and had taken a walk around the property simply because standing still had never agreed with her when there was daylight to use. The ranch was larger than it had appeared from the road. The fields behind the house stretched back for what looked like several hundred acres, most of it empty now in late autumn. But even under the dry stubble of harvested crop, she could see that the soil was good, dark and deep, the kind that holds water when water's available. That was the problem. Water. She found the main irrigation channel running along the western edge of the back field, a dug trench mostly, lined in places with flat stones. It should have carried water from the creek she could hear but not yet see to the north. But the channel was partially collapsed about 200 yards from the house. The banks caved in on the south side. The trench silted up and choked with 3 seasons' worth of dead vegetation. Whoever had tried to clear it before had removed the plants from the surface but hadn't dug out the silt, which meant it would clog again within a season, even if you patched the bank. She crouched down next to the collapse and put her hand in the soil. It was moist below the surface, a good sign. The water table was there. The channel just wasn't reaching it properly. She was still crouched in the dirt with her coat pulled up around her ears when she heard boots on the ground behind her. "What are you doing?" Silas asked. "Your irrigation channel collapsed here." She pointed at the caved bank. "And here, you can see where it's silted up starting about 15 feet back. The plants were cleared off the top, but the silt was never dredged. You're losing at least a third of your water before it reaches the main field." A pause. "I know." She looked up at him. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets, his expression the same flat, reserved thing it had been since she arrived. "You've tried to fix it?" she asked. "Twice." "What approach did you use?" He looked at her for a moment like he was deciding whether this conversation was worth continuing. "Packed the bank with clay and rock, cleared the vegetation, redirected a section." "Did you dredge the silt?" Another pause, this one different. "No. That's why it's failing. The clay and rock pack will hold the bank, but if the silt isn't cleared, the water can't flow with enough pressure to keep the channel from choking again. You need to dredge first, then repack, then line the base with gravel so fine sediment doesn't settle the same way." She stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees. "It's a two-person job, but it's not a complicated one." Silas was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You know irrigation?" he said. "My father farmed 40 acres in Ohio from the time I was 8 until the year he died. I learned what I needed to learn." She paused. "I know how it looks. I'll leave the irrigating to you. I'm just telling you what I see." She walked back toward the house, and she didn't look back to see whether he was still watching her. But he was. She knew it without turning around, the same way you know when weather's coming before the clouds have fully gathered. By the third day, she had reorganized the pantry, repaired the handle on the kitchen door that had been loose and sticking, sharpened 2 of the 3 kitchen knives using a whetstone she found in the barn, and started a proper inventory of the dry goods so they'd know what needed ordering before the winter set in hard. None of it was asked for. None of it was commented on. Silas moved around the edges of her industry like a man who wasn't sure what to make of weather that kept changing. He wasn't unfriendly, exactly. He wasn't anything, exactly. He was present and then absent, working the barn and the fence lines and the places where the cold was already finding weaknesses in structures not properly prepared for it. He had a hired hand named Foster, a boy of maybe 17 who appeared at meals, worked without complaint, and had the useful quality of never asking questions that slowed things down. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she found a broken plow blade in the barn. It wasn't in use. It was leaning against the back wall behind a stack of hay bales, which meant either it had been abandoned there or put aside for repair and forgotten. She carried it out into the light and looked at the break. It was a clean fracture, not a stress crack, which meant it could be repaired if someone knew what they were doing with metal. She was still examining it when Silas came around the corner of the barn. "That's been broken since spring," he said. "I know, I can see the oxidation on the brake face." She set it against the fence post. "Do you have a forge?" He looked at her. "You work metal?" "My father had one. I'm not a blacksmith, but I can do basic repairs if the forge is in good condition, and I have what I need." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dry grass along the fence line with a sound like something whispering. "I'll show you," he said. The forge was in a lean-to attached to the back of the barn. A modest setup, a small bellows, a good anvil that was worth considerably more than anything else in the structure. It was cold and unlit, but the equipment was sound and someone had oiled the bellows relatively recently. She asked for the coal, the tongs, and a half hour. He gave her all 3 and then stayed, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and watching. She didn't mind being watched. She'd been watched all her life. Watched and assessed and found useful or found wanting, depending on who was doing the looking. She just did the work and let the work speak. It took her closer to 45 minutes. The repair wasn't pretty. There was a slight irregularity in the seam where the metal had been rejoined, but it was solid. She could guarantee it would hold through a full season's plowing, possibly more. She held it out to Silas. He took it, turned it in his hands, ran his thumb along the seam. "That'll work," he said. "It's not perfect." "It doesn't have to be perfect," he said. "It has to work." He looked up from the blade, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she had the sense that he was actually seeing her. Not assessing her, not cataloging her, but actually looking at her as a person rather than a problem that had arrived on his property unannounced. It lasted only a moment. Then he handed the blade back and went to put it with the other equipment, and the expression closed off again, like a shutter pulled across a window. But she'd seen it. That evening, Calhoun asked her to sit with him on the porch after supper. It was cold, properly cold now, the kind that settles into Dakota after October like it intends to stay a long while. But he had a blanket for his knees and a pipe he didn't light, just held. and he looked out at the dark fields with the comfortable ease of a man who'd done this particular thing 10,000 times. My grandson fixed that irrigation channel 3 years ago, Calhoun said, after a long silence. And the year before that. Twice, like he told you. I know. Rowan had her coat wrapped tightly and her hands tucked under her arms. He worked hard on it. He did. Works hard on everything. The old man turned his cup, coffee again, always coffee, in his gnarled hands. The ranch was bigger when his father ran it. We had 4 hired hands and 40 head of cattle in addition to the crops. Then his father died, and then his mother the year after, and then his wife 2 years after that, and each time something left with them, not just the people. Something in the way the place worked. Rowan was quiet. Silas doesn't talk about any of that, Calhoun continued, in case you were wondering why he's the way he is. I wasn't planning to ask. No, I didn't think you were. He looked at the fields again. The sky above the horizon was absolutely full of stars, the kind of sky you only see far from any town, where darkness is still actually dark. You walked the South Irrigation Channel this morning. Yes, you walked it like you were looking at something that needed to be understood. Not just fixed, understood. He paused. Gideon Cross is a businessman, good at buying land and moving money around. What he'd have wanted from an arranged wife is someone capable of running a household and presenting well when there are people to present to. That's a reasonable expectation, Rowan said carefully. Reasonable, Calhoun repeated, with something in his voice that wasn't quite agreement. You know what this land needs? Someone who looks at a broken irrigation channel and asks why it keeps breaking, not just how to patch it one more time. The wind moved through the grass below the porch steps. Rowan understood that the conversation had turned into something other than what it appeared to be, and she understood equally that the wisest response was silence. She was leaving in one day. She had a commitment and a name written on a piece of paper and a life waiting to be assembled 12 miles east. She was not going to allow herself to be moved by an old man's carefully placed words, however much they settled into her like water finding its level. I should go in, she said. It's cold. It is, Calhoun agreed and didn't move. She stood up from the chair and pulled her coat straight. She was almost to the door when he spoke again, almost to himself, almost too quiet to hear. Took this land 50 years to grow soil that good, he said. Land waits a long time for the right person. She went inside without answering. She lay awake for a long time after, looking at the ceiling of the east-facing room while the cold wind pressed against the bottom of the window that didn't quite close. The morning of the 4th day arrived with a sky the color of pewter and the smell of snow in the air, distant but coming. Rowan was up before the light as usual, and she stood at the east window in her coat with her hands around a cup of hot water because the coffee hadn't finished yet, and she looked at the fields as they slowly came visible in the gray pre-dawn. The south field was dormant, brown, and flat. The north field, closer to where the creek ran, had the dried remnants of a better crop. She could see it in the way the stubble stood higher and denser. The east field, the one closest to the house, was the largest, and it was also where the irrigation failure mattered most. If that channel worked properly, that field could produce considerably more than it was producing now. The soil was right. The water table was right. It was just the infrastructure that was failing. Stop it, she told herself. This was not her ranch. This was not her irrigation problem. In a few hours, the stage would come through, and she would put her trunk on it and travel east and arrive at Gideon Cross's property and begin the life she'd agreed to. That was sensible. That was rational. That was what a person of good judgment and personal integrity did. She heard Silas come downstairs, his footsteps distinct from Calhoun's more careful movement. She heard him go out to the barn without coming through the kitchen. She poured herself actual coffee when the pot was ready and stood at the kitchen window watching the light come up over the fields. The stage came through at 10:30 in the morning. She was standing at the road with her trunk by 10 because being ready on time was something she'd learned early and never unlearned. Foster had carried the trunk out for her without being asked, set it at the road edge, and gone back to his work. She'd stood there with her bag over her shoulder and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she'd looked down the road toward wherever it went and tried to feel certain about what she was doing. She heard the door of the house open and close. Silas walked down from the house and stood about 6 feet from her. He had his hat pulled down against the wind and his hands in his coat pockets, and he looked at her trunk, and then at the road, and then at some middle distance that was neither. "You found the weak post in the northeast corner of the lower pasture fence," he said, "while you were walking yesterday." She blinked. "I wasn't going to say anything about it. It's a 2-hour fix if you have the posts and wire." "I have both." He was quiet for a moment. "The irrigation channel. Your idea about the gravel lining. Would that actually work?" "Yes. The principle is sound. You dredge the silt, repack the banks with puddled clay rather than dry, then line the base with a layer of coarse gravel before the water runs. The gravel allows fine particles to pass through without settling into a solid block. It won't need attention for 4 or 5 years minimum." The wind moved between them. "You know all this," he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was something closer to bewildered. "You know land and water and metal and how to keep a kitchen that works? You know how to walk a property and see what's wrong with it." "My father taught me what he knew," Rowan said. "I paid attention." "Why are you going to Crosses?" The question was blunt in the way that only genuine questions are. Not rhetorical, not pointed, just actual curiosity finding the shortest path to what it wanted to know. She looked at him. "Because I made an arrangement." "Cross wants a wife who can manage a household and keep decent company," Silas said. "He doesn't need someone who can diagnose an irrigation failure." A pause. "I'm not saying anything bad about him. I'm just saying what I know." "What are you saying exactly?" she asked. He looked at the road, then back at her. He seemed to be working through something the way a man works through a knot, carefully, without forcing it. "I'm saying this ranch has a problem I've been trying to solve for 3 years and you solved it in 4 days. Another pause. "I'm saying it's been a long time since this place felt like it was moving instead of just holding together." The stage appeared around the bend in the road, still a 1/4 mile off, the horses visible as small shapes against the gray sky. Silas looked at it and then back at her, and his jaw was tight in the way of someone saying something they find difficult to say. "I'm not asking you to stay," he said. "You have somewhere to go. That's your right." A beat. "I'm just telling you what I see. Because you told me what you saw, and it was worth hearing." The stage got closer. She could hear it now, the creak of the wheels, the sound of the horses working. Rowan looked at the road. She looked at the east field and the dormant soil and the line where the irrigation channel ran beneath the surface of the brown grass. She looked at the house, gray and weathered and imperfect, and the barn with its sagging roofline, and the forge and the lean-to where a plow blade was now repaired and waiting. She thought about Calhoun's voice on the porch the night before, almost too quiet to hear. Land waits a long time for the right person. The stage slowed at the road junction, and the driver called down with the flat certainty of a man who is sure of himself. "You heading east, miss?" Rowan's hand was on her trunk. She stood there for a moment that stretched out longer than a moment, while the horses shifted and the driver waited, and Silas stood 6 feet away with his hands in his coat pockets and his expression closed the way it always was, closed like a shutter against whatever was happening on the inside of it. "Miss?" the driver said again. Her hand tightened on the trunk handle. "What would you need?" she said to Silas, and her voice was steady because she had trained herself over many years to sound steady when she was not. "If someone were going to manage this property properly, what would you need?" Silas looked at her for a long moment. "Someone who could see what the land needs," he said, and wasn't afraid of the work. The stage driver made an impatient sound. Rowan let go of the trunk. "Then I suppose," she said, and she felt something shift inside her like earth after a long dry season finally taking water. "You had better tell me the rest of what's wrong with the irrigation system." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he bent and picked up one end of the trunk. "There's a secondary channel on the north side that nobody's looked at since my father's time," he said. "It'll need to be surveyed before the ground freezes hard." "I'll need boots that fit properly," she said. "Mine are city boots. Foster's sister left a pair in the barn. They might work." The stage driver said something under his breath, gave up, and moved on. They carried the trunk back up to the house in the cold gray morning, and neither of them said anything more, and Calhoun was standing at the kitchen window when they came in, and the look on his face was the private look of a man who has just watched something he expected to happen finally happen. He said nothing. He poured her a fresh coffee and set it on the table and went back to his chair, and that was enough. Outside, the wind moved across the fields with a sound like something beginning. The North Channel was worse than either of them had expected. Rowan found that out on the first morning she went to survey it properly, pulling on Foster's sister's boots, which were half a size too large and rubbed at the heel, and walking the fence line north toward the creek with a coil of measuring rope and a notebook she'd found in the kitchen drawer. Silas had offered to come. She'd told him she'd report back what she found, and something in the way she said it made him nod and go back to the barn without argument, which she appreciated. She needed to look at things without someone watching her look at them. The North Channel was older than the South one. She could tell from the way the stones lining it had settled deep into the earth, tilted and moss-covered on the shaded side. It ran from the creek bend about 400 yards down toward the upper corner of the north field, and for maybe the first 100 yards it was functional, carrying a thin trickle of cold water that caught the morning light. Then it hit a section where a cottonwood had come down, years ago, from the look of the root system, and the trunk had never been fully cleared, just cut back enough to get past, and the root mass underneath had heaved the channel bed upward by nearly 8 inches. Water that couldn't rise over the obstruction had been diverting sideways for seasons, spreading into a marshy low spot between the field and the fence line that grew nothing useful. She stood at the obstruction for a long time, measuring, making notes, stepping carefully across the soggy ground to check the extent of the lateral spread. The root system would need to come out entirely. That was a significant job, more than 2 people could do in a day, but it was the only real solution. Cutting around it would just move the problem. She walked back to the house with mud on the boots and a clear picture in her head, and found Silas at the kitchen table eating a late breakfast and reading something, which surprised her slightly. She hadn't taken him for a reader. Then she saw it was a surveyor's map of the property, worn at the folds, and she revised her assessment. She sat down across from him and spread her notebook on the table. "The cottonwood root mass has to come out," she said. "All of it. It's heaved the channel bed almost 8 inches, and it's been diverting water sideways for at least 3 or 4 years, maybe longer. That marshy section on the north side of the upper field, that's where your water's been going." Silas looked at her notes. He turned the map slightly so she could see it too, and pointed to the area she was describing. "My father dug around that root mass once. He said pulling it would collapse the channel bank." "He was right, if you pulled it without preparation," Rowan said. "You'd need to pre-shore the bank on both sides before removal. Drive stakes and plank it temporarily, pull the roots, regrade the channel bed, then pull the shoring as you repack with clay. It's more work, but the bank holds." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her notes. "Where'd you learn pre-shoring?" "I didn't. I'm reasoning it from first principles." She met his look evenly. "I might be wrong about the specific technique, but the principle is sound." "You might be wrong," he repeated. "Yes." He seemed to appreciate that more than he would have appreciated certainty. He looked back at the map. "Foster can help with the labor. I know a man in town who's done channel work, Aldous Pratt. He'd know if your shoring idea would hold." "That's reasonable," Rowan said. She got up to refill her coffee and found Calhoun standing in the kitchen doorway, leaning on the frame with his arms crossed, watching the two of them at the table over the maps and the notebook with an expression of supreme personal satisfaction that he was making very little effort to conceal. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just getting coffee." He moved past her and poured himself a cup and went back to the other room. And she heard him settle into his chair with the comfortable deliberateness of a man who had just confirmed something he'd suspected for a while. She sat back down across from Silas, and they went back to the map. And if she noticed that this was the most comfortable she'd felt in a room with another person in longer than she could precisely remember, she didn't remark on it. The community's opinion of Rowan Hale, such as it was, reached her in pieces over the following 2 weeks. The nearest town was Caldwell Ford, 8 miles west, a proper town by Dakota standards, with a dry goods store, a feed and hardware operation, a small post office, and a saloon that also served as the venue for any social gathering that required more than one family's front room. Silas rode in twice a week for supplies or business, and he started taking Rowan along on the second week because there were things that needed ordering for the irrigation work and she knew what materials were required. The first time she walked into the dry goods store with him and began specifying lumber dimensions and clay quantities and coarse gravel grades, the man behind the counter, a heavy-set fellow named Mercer with an impressive mustache and a natural tendency toward skepticism, looked at Silas and waited. "She's managing the supply side of the irrigation project," Silas said. Mercer looked back at Rowan. "Uh-huh. And do you know what you're ordering, miss? Or are you working off a list someone else wrote?" "I wrote the list," Rowan said pleasantly. "The coarse gravel needs to be at least 3/4-inch aggregate. If you give me less than that, it'll compact and we'll lose the drainage effect. The lumber for the shoring should be rough cut, not finished, because it needs to grip the soil rather than slide. And I need to know what you charge for a half barrel of type C clay pitch versus mixing our own from the creekbed deposit." Mercer's mustache did something complicated. "Creekbed clay'd be cheaper." "I know, but creekbed clay in this part of the territory tends to run high in sand content, which means it shrinks on drying and cracks. I'd rather pay for reliable material." He looked at her for another moment. Then he pulled out his order ledger without further comment and started writing. It was a small victory, and not entirely satisfying because she knew what Mercer thought, what most of them thought, in their polite and not quite polite ways. She was helpful. She was capable for a woman. She was a good thing for Silas, someone to keep the place running while he figures out what he's doing with that ranch. She was useful the way a good tool is useful, noted when functioning, ignored when it comes to questions of worth or permanence. She heard this at the post office, where a woman named Darla Fitch asked Silas warmly how long his arrangement was going to last, and glanced at Rowan with a smile that was perfectly friendly and contained no acknowledgement whatsoever that Rowan was a person who might have opinions about the question. She heard it at the feed store when one of the other ranchers, a man she'd never met, said to Silas, "Got yourself some help finally. Good," and walked past her without making eye contact. She heard the same thing in different shapes in every interaction, and she recognized it the way you recognize a smell that's been in a room so long you almost stop noticing it. She'd been not quite seen before. She'd been useful, but not quite there for most of her adult life. It wasn't surprising. It was just occasionally tiring. What surprised her was that it bothered her more here than it had bothered her other places. She spent 2 days trying to figure out why before she admitted the answer, quietly, and without much ceremony. Because here, for reasons she didn't entirely understand, she had started to care whether it changed. Silas noticed. She was fairly sure of that, though he said nothing specific. What he did instead was start talking to her differently. Not dramatically. It wasn't a sudden change, it was more like a gradual shift in weather, one of those slow pressure changes you feel before you can see the evidence of it. He started asking her opinion on things that weren't directly related to the ranch work. What she thought about the fence line placement on the east pasture, whether she'd noticed anything about the condition of the stock, what she made of a piece of correspondence he'd received from a land assessor in Bismarck that had language in it he didn't entirely trust. That last conversation happened in the evening, at the kitchen table after supper, with the lamp pulled close and the letter flattened between them. Calhoun had already gone up to bed, and Foster had long since gone home to wherever he slept, and the house was quiet in the way it only got in the later hours when the wind dropped off. "This clause here," Silas said, pointing to the third paragraph, "it says the assessment is for current productive use rather than potential productive use. I don't know if that's standard." Rowan read the paragraph. Then she read the one before it. "It's not standard. Standard assessments in this territory use potential yield. I know because the land placement service I came through sent me materials about Dakota land valuation when I was preparing for the arrangement. Current productive use means they're valuing the ranch at what it's producing right now, not what it could produce with proper irrigation and management." "Which would make it worth less," Silas said slowly, "considerably less." She looked at him. "Who sent this?" "Land assessor's office in Bismarck. Routine, supposedly. Every operating ranch in the county." "Does Gideon Cross have land adjacent to yours?" The silence that followed had a different quality than the other silences between them. Silas looked at her carefully. "East and south borders," he said. "He's been buying parcels for 3 years." She looked at the letter again. She didn't say what she was thinking because she wasn't certain and certainty mattered, but she folded the letter carefully and pushed it back toward him. "You should have someone else review the assessment before you sign anything," she said. "Someone who isn't connected to the county office." He picked up the letter and looked at it a moment longer. You think there's something wrong with it? I think it's worth verifying. She paused. I think you should know the actual value of what you own before anyone puts a number on it for you. He set the letter down and looked at the lamp flame, which was doing that thing lamp flames do in drafty rooms, leaning slightly, recovering, leaning again. He had a habit of going quiet when he was thinking through something substantial, and she'd learned to let the quiet run rather than fill it. My father borrowed against this land twice, he said finally. First time to expand the herd, second time after my mother got sick. After he died, my wife and I paid it down, but it took years. He paused. Gideon Cross bought the Harlan property to the south 2 years ago. Harlan was a decent farmer, but he had debt, and the assessment that came through undervalued his south field by almost 40%. He sold because he didn't know better. Rowan was quiet. Now I know why you asked, he said. I asked because the language seemed unusual, she said. I don't know Cross well enough to say anything certain about his intentions. I know him well enough, Silas said, and left it there. The lamp leaned and recovered. Outside, the wind was beginning to pick up again, pressing against the window glass with a sound like something persistent and patient. I'll ride to Bismarck this week, he said. There's a lawyer there I trust, old friend of Calhoun's. That's the right move, Rowan said. He looked at her across the table. You figured all that out from one paragraph of a letter. You figured it out too, she said. You just needed confirmation. He was quiet for another moment, and then he said almost to himself, what did Cross think he was getting exactly when he arranged to marry you? She felt the question land somewhere it wasn't supposed to land, and she kept her expression steady. A capable woman who could manage a household. He wasn't going to get that, Silas said. She looked at him. Excuse me? He was going to get more than that and not know what to do with it. He said it flatly, without any apparent awareness that it was a significant thing to say. He pushed back from the table and stood up. I'll check the barn. You should sleep. We're moving the shoring lumber to the channel site in the morning. He took the lamp and left her sitting at the table in the near dark, and she sat there for a while listening to the wind against the glass and feeling something in her chest that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely unpleasant, and that she could not, no matter how she tried, talk herself into naming as anything other than what it was. Gideon Cross arrived on a Thursday. She knew who he was before he got off his horse, because he matched the description exactly, the gray vest, the clean jaw, the broad shoulders, and because he rode onto the property with the particular ease of a man who has never genuinely questioned whether he has the right to be wherever he is. He was not unpleasant looking. He had a straight posture and a ready smile and manners that were practiced without being stiff. Under different circumstances, Rowan thought she might have found him reasonable company. He dismounted at the house, and Silas came out from the barn, and the two men exchanged a handshake that was cordial on the surface and carried about 6 different kinds of tension underneath it, if you knew how to read people. Silas, Cross said, heard there was a mix-up with the stage. Thought I'd come sort it out personally. He looked at Rowan, and his smile adjusted, slightly warmer, more directed. Miss Hale, I'm sorry for the confusion. I hope you haven't been too inconvenienced. Not at all, Rowan said. Good. Good. He glanced around the property with the quick, assessing look of a man who is always calculating. Well, I've got a room ready for you in town. You can stay there until we can get the arrangements moving forward properly. Wedding doesn't need to wait much longer. Situation's already irregular enough. The word irregular landed with a specific weight, and she saw Silas's jaw tighten slightly. Mr. Cross, Silas said, Miss Hale is currently contracted to manage this property. Cross looked at him. The ready smile held, but something behind it changed. Is she? Employment contract signed and filed 3 days ago. It wasn't true. It wasn't true yet, but Rowan kept her face absolutely still because she understood immediately what Silas was doing and she wasn't going to undercut it. Cross looked at her. Miss Hale, are you telling me you'd rather stay on here? There was a slight pause that contained about a paragraph of implication, then honor the arrangement we made? I'm telling you I have an obligation I intend to fulfill, she said. I don't leave things unfinished. Cross looked between the two of them. His expression was still pleasant. Men like him, she knew, rarely let unpleasant feelings show on their faces. They kept them in the part of their minds where decisions get made quietly. "We'll talk again," he said, and it was aimed more at Silas than at her. He remounted and rode off at a pace that was just slightly too fast to look casual, and Silas watched him go until the road bent and took him out of sight. "You told him I was contracted," Rowan said. "You are," Silas said, "or you will be in about an hour. Calhoun's been drafting it all week." He looked at her. "If you want to sign it." She looked at the empty road where Cross had gone, then at the north field, where the shoring lumber was stacked and waiting at the edge of the channel site. "Get me the paper," she said. Calhoun had written the contract in his careful, old-fashioned hand on 2 sheets of good paper, and it was more thorough than Rowan had expected. She read it at the kitchen table that evening, with the lamp pulled close, going through it the way she'd learned to read anything important, slowly, starting from the bottom, looking for the language that mattered most. It named her as ranch manager, with authority over operational decisions, purchasing, and labor. It specified a wage, modest but real. It ran for 1 year, with renewal by mutual agreement. And buried in the 3rd paragraph, written in the same unhurried script as everything else, was a clause stating that any external party seeking to alter her employment status would require written notice filed with the county land office no less than 30 days in advance. 30 days. She looked up at Calhoun, who was sitting in his chair across the room pretending to read. "This clause," she said, "the 30-day notice requirement. Standard employment language," he said without looking up. "It isn't standard at all." He turned a page. She looked back at the contract. Silas was leaning against the kitchen doorframe with his arms crossed, watching her read, and when she glanced at him, he had the expression of a man who had already read the document and decided it was satisfactory. "Cross could challenge this," she said. "He could try," Calhoun said, "but it's filed and witnessed, and the county land office closes at 5 o'clock on Fridays. Today is Thursday." He finally looked up, and those pale blue eyes held a satisfaction that was entirely undisguised. "I had Foster write it in this afternoon." Rowan sat with that for a moment. This old man, who moved carefully downstairs and held his coffee cup in both hands because of the arthritis, had been 3 steps ahead of Gideon Cross for the better part of a week. "You drafted this before Cross even showed up," she said. "I drafted it the day after you let the stage go without you," Calhoun said simply. "I've been watching men like Gideon Cross for 60 years. I know what they do next." She looked at the contract again. She picked up the pen. She signed it. The irrigation work started the following Monday, when the ground was cold, but not yet frozen solid. There was maybe a 2-week window before the frost went deep enough to make digging impossible, and Rowan had no intention of losing it. Aldous Pratt came out from town as Silas had suggested, a quiet man in his 60s who walked the channel site without speaking for nearly 20 minutes before he crouched at the root obstruction and poked at the heaved channel bed with a stick and said, "Pre-shore it first. Your instinct's right," and then stood up and walked back to his wagon. "That's it?" Rowan said. "That's it," Pratt said. "You don't need me to tell you how to do your own work." He climbed up onto the wagon seat. "The stakes need to go in at a 7-degree angle, not straight vertical. It's the angle that holds under lateral pressure." He picked up the reins. "Don't use less than 8-inch plank width." He drove away. Rowan stood at the channel site and made a note about the angle. The work itself was hard and muddy and went wrong in the specific ways that physical labor always goes wrong. The first set of stakes went in slightly off angle and had to come out and go in again, which cost them half a morning. One section of bank that had looked stable turned out to have an air pocket underneath it that collapsed inward when they started digging near the root mass, and they spent 2 hours shoring that before they could continue. Foster worked with a steady, uncomplaining competence that she'd come to rely on, and Silas worked the way he did everything, methodically, without wasted motion, not talking much, but present in a way that made the work feel less like something being done in isolation. On the second day, when they were into the root mass extraction, and the mud was up to their knees and the temperature had dropped another 6 degrees since morning, Foster hit a section of root that went deeper than the probe had suggested, and his spade handle cracked under the force of his attempt to lever it out. "Replacement handles are in the barn," Silas said, "back left wall." "I know where they are," Foster said, somewhat irritably, pulling himself out of the trench. Rowan watched him go and then looked at the exposed root mass and the mud in the cold sky overhead and felt the specific kind of tiredness that settles into a person, not from the body, but from the accumulation of small things going wrong. "You're not discouraged," Silas said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him. He was standing knee-deep in the trench with mud on his coat and his hat and most of his face, and he was watching her. "I'm tired," she said. "That's different. Most people would have given up on this channel a long time ago." "Most people gave up on it years ago," she said. "That's why it's still broken." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife tried to get me to hire someone to fix it the first year. I said we didn't have the money. Second year I said it wasn't the right time. Third year she stopped asking." He picked up his own spade and went back to working at the root mass. "I've spent 3 years fixing things the wrong way because I wouldn't stop long enough to figure out the right way." She watched his profile, the set of his jaw, the way he worked the spade with the particular focused economy of someone who'd been doing physical labor since childhood. "You fixed plenty of things right," she said, "not the ones that mattered." Foster came back with the new handle, and they went back to work, and the conversation folded itself away into the mud and the cold like it had never happened. But it stayed with her, the way things do when they land in a place that was already prepared to receive them. Cross came back on the 9th day of November, and this time he brought a man with him. The man was introduced as a county administrator named Fells, thin, official-looking, carrying a leather case with brass clasps. They came on a Tuesday afternoon when Rowan was in the kitchen going over the supply inventory and Silas was out at the channel site. Calhoun answered the door, which was either coincidence or not, knowing Calhoun. Rowan came to the hallway and saw Cross in the doorway, hat in hand, smile in place, and Fells behind him with the leather case held in both hands like an offering. "Miss Hale," Cross said, "is Silas in?" "He's working," she said. "I can wait." He stepped inside without being invited, which told her something, and looked around the kitchen and hallway with the same quick assessment she'd seen from him before. His eyes went to the stack of survey maps on the kitchen table, and then to the materials list she'd been working from, and he looked at these things with an expression that was polite and attentive and contained something cold underneath. "I understand you filed an employment contract," he said. "The ranch filed an employment contract," Rowan said. "Standard practice for a management position." "Of course." He set his hat on the side table near the door, again, without asking. "I've had Mr. Fells look into the language of the agreement. There are some questions about its validity given the circumstances of your arrival on this property." Fells opened the leather case and produced a document. He held it out toward her with the slightly apologetic air of a man who knows he's doing something uncomfortable, but has decided being paid matters more. She didn't take it. "What circumstances?" she said. "You were sent here under an arrangement with me," Cross said, and the pleasantness was still there, but the warmth had gone out of it. "You were supposed to come to my property. The fact that you ended up here was a mistake. Your own words, I'm told. An employment contract entered into under those conditions could be considered what?" Silas's voice came from the hallway behind Rowan, and she hadn't heard him come in. He was still in his work clothes, mud on his boots, and he stood in the hallway looking at Cross and Fells with an expression that was completely flat. Cross turned to him. "Silas, I was just explaining to Miss Hale. I heard what you were explaining." Silas moved past Rowan into the room, and his size, which she'd grown accustomed to, suddenly registered differently in the confined space. "You want to tell me on what basis you challenge a legally filed employment agreement?" "The circumstances of..." "She was stranded on my property because of a stagecoach error. She offered to work for room and board. I hired her. 4 days later, I offered her a formal management contract. She accepted, and it was filed according to county procedure." He looked at Fells. "Is there a law against that?" Fells had the document half extended toward no one in particular, and the expression of a man reconsidering several recent decisions. "Well, technically..." "Is there a law against it?" Silas said again, slower. Fells lowered the document. "No," he said. "No, there isn't." Cross looked at Silas. The pleasant expression was entirely gone now, and what was underneath it was not rage. It was the colder and more dangerous thing, which was calculation. "You understand what you're doing," Cross said. "Don't you?" "I understand what you're doing," Silas said. I had a lawyer in Bismarck look at that land assessment letter you sent through the county office, the one that values this property at current productive use rather than potential yield. He paused. Martin Lowe says that's not standard language. He also says you've used the same assessor on 2 other purchases in the past 18 months. The silence in the kitchen was the kind that has mass. That's a serious accusation, Cross said. It's an observation, Silas said, about a pattern. He looked at Fells. I'd like you to leave my property. Fells closed the leather case with the speed of a man grateful for any instruction that gave him a direction to move in. He was out the door in about 30 seconds. Cross was slower. He picked up his hat and turned it in his hands and looked at Silas with an expression that had moved past calculation into something that was purely personal. She won't stay, Cross said quietly. Women like her don't stay in places like this. Women like her, Silas repeated. Capable, ambitious. She'll work herself into the ground for your ranch, and the day she realizes there's nothing here for her but the work, she'll leave. Same as your wife did. Rowan saw it happen. Saw the word land in Silas the way a struck match lands on dry material, a fraction of a second of nothing, and then something that couldn't be taken back. His jaw went tight, and his hands were still, and his eyes were a different thing entirely from what they'd been a moment before. Get out, he said, and the evenness of his voice was worse than any volume would have been. Cross left. They heard his horse a moment later, moving away fast. The kitchen was very quiet. Silas stood with his back to her, looking at the door, and she could see the effort it was taking him to put whatever had just moved through him back into whatever place it normally lived. It took a while. She didn't fill the silence. She'd learned by now that his silences weren't absences. They were where he did his actual work. I'm sorry, he said finally. He wasn't looking at her. He was trying to get a reaction, she said. He got one. That's his skill. He was right about my wife. He turned around, and his expression was the closed one she'd seen less of lately, the shutterdown look. She left in the 3rd year. I don't blame her. I was somewhere else most of the time, even when I was standing in the same room. Rowan didn't know what to do with that, so she did what she usually did with things she didn't know what to do with. She let it be what it was. He wasn't right about the rest of it, she said. He looked at her. She held the look. He wasn't right about the rest of it, she said again, steadily. After a moment, he nodded. Once. And then he went to wash the mud off his hands, and she went back to the inventory list, and the afternoon moved on. They broke the root mass out on a Thursday, and when it finally came free, it came with a sound like something the ground had been holding on to against its will, a deep, reluctant tearing, and all 3 of them stood at the edge of the trench covered in mud and breathing hard and looked at the hole where it had been. There it is, Foster said. There it is, Rowan agreed. Silas said nothing, which by now she understood was his version of relief. They spent the rest of that day and all of the next regrading the channel bed and repacking the banks, and on the Saturday they ran the gravel and laid it in the base section, working from north to south, tamping it carefully. The channel had been dry as a bone for 3 years. The gravel sat gray and clean in the pale November light, and the whole thing looked like a wound cleaned and closed. Not pretty, not finished, but done right. Sunday morning, Silas opened the intake valve at the creek. They all stood downstream, the 3 of them and Calhoun, who had walked out from the house slowly and stood on the bank with his blanket around his shoulders and his coffee in both hands, and waited. It took longer than she'd expected. She started to wonder if she'd miscalculated something, if the grade was off or the gravel too compacted or some variable she hadn't accounted for. She started running the design back through her head, looking for the error, and her stomach was doing the particular thing it does when you've committed fully to something and the moment of finding out arrives. Then they heard it, a sound like a decision being made. Water moving through an enclosed space, building pressure, finding its way through the new channel bed, pushing the first cold surge around the bend and into the straightened section, and then into the gravel base, and then past them with a sound that was nothing dramatic, nothing remarkable, just water moving where it was supposed to move for the first time in years. Calhoun made a sound that wasn't a word. Foster said, "Well, I'll be." The water ran along the channel and out into the Northfield's distribution trenches, spreading out across the dry soil in small fingers, and the soil, that dark, deep Dakota soil she'd put her hand in on her first morning, took it in the way ground takes in exactly what it needed. Rowan stood at the edge of the channel and watched the water run, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was a grief so small and precise she almost didn't recognize it as grief. A grief for her father, who had taught her everything she'd used to build this, and who had never seen land as good as this land, and who would have loved it. She kept her face still. This wasn't the place for it. Silas was standing beside her, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him without moving much. He was looking at the water in the channel, and then he looked at her, and she kept her eyes on the field. "You did that," he said quietly. "We did that," she said. "All four of us and Aldous Pratt and his 7-degree angle." He was quiet for a moment. "Rowan," she looked at him. His expression was the open one, the one she'd only seen a handful of times, the one she suspected cost him something to show. He seemed to be on the edge of saying something. She could see the words forming and then the old hesitation rising up to meet them, that years-long habit of keeping the shutter down. Whatever it was, he didn't say it, but she saw it, and she understood it, and that was its own kind of language between two people who'd both spent a long time learning to speak without words, in the way of people who'd been left alone with things too important to say out loud. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't know until it was almost too late, was that 4 days later a woman would ride onto this property, and everything she'd let herself begin to feel would close down inside her like water through a valve turned shut. The stage from Bismarck came through Caldwell Ford on a Wednesday. Silas had written a letter 6 weeks ago, before Rowan had arrived, before any of this. A letter to a woman named Eleanor Marsh, proposing an arrangement. Eleanor Marsh arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in November, and she was everything the letter had promised: composed, practical, kind-looking, of appropriate age and background. Rowan was in the barn when they rode in. She heard the voices and came to the barn door and stood there in the shadow, looking out at the yard, and watched Silas help the woman down from the wagon with the automatic courtesy he showed everyone. She stood there for a moment, very still, the way you stand when you've just put your foot on a step that isn't there. Then she went back into the barn and picked up the work she'd set down, and she was very careful not to think about anything at all. Eleanor Marsh was not what Rowan had braced herself for. She'd spent the rest of that Wednesday afternoon in the barn doing inventory that didn't need doing, rearranging equipment that was already arranged, and constructing in her mind a version of Eleanor Marsh that was easier to manage, someone difficult or cold or obvious in her unsuitability. People do that. They build the version of a thing that makes their own position easier to hold. Eleanor Marsh didn't cooperate with any of it. She was perhaps 30, with a direct, unhurried manner, and the kind of practical clothing that suggested she'd thought carefully about what Dakota winters required before she'd packed. She had a steady handshake and didn't look around the house the way people look around a house when they're assessing it for their own purposes. At supper that first evening, she asked Calhoun about the history of the property with what seemed like genuine interest, listened to the answer, and asked a follow-up question that proved she'd actually heard the first one. Rowan sat across the table and watched this and felt the particular exhaustion of finding someone entirely reasonable when you'd hoped they'd be otherwise. Silas was awkward in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not cold, she'd seen him cold, but uncertain, which was different. He passed things at the table before they were asked for, which he never did. He asked Eleanor twice whether the room was warm enough, which Rowan suspected was about twice more than he'd asked anyone anything about personal comfort in recent memory. He was trying, visibly and effortfully, and watching it was its own specific kind of difficult. She went to bed early and told herself it was because she was tired. The days that followed had a quality she couldn't quite name. Everything continuing as normal on the surface, while something underneath shifted and settled like ground after a heavy rain. The ranch work didn't stop. The irrigation channels needed monitoring now that water was running through them. The east pasture fence had a new weak section Foster had found, and there was the matter of the supply order for winter that she'd been building for 2 weeks and needed to finalize before the road conditions made the trip to town unreliable. She did all of it. She did it the same way she'd done everything since arriving, methodically, without drama, staying in the work because the work was the only territory she was entirely certain of. Eleanor helped where she could, and this made things both easier and harder. Easier because there was another set of competent hands. Harder because Eleanor was observant, and Rowan had the growing and uncomfortable sense that Eleanor was observing things Rowan would have preferred go unobserved. It came to a point on the fourth day when they were both in the kitchen working on the winter supply list. Rowan reviewing quantities, Eleanor writing out a fair copy because her handwriting was better, and Silas came in from outside and said something to Rowan about the east pasture fence, and Rowan answered, and there was a brief exchange about materials and timing that lasted maybe 2 minutes and was entirely practical, and then Silas went back out. Eleanor set down the pen. "How long have you been in love with him?" she asked. Rowan's pencil stopped moving. "I'm not," she said. Eleanor looked at her with a patience that was not unkind. "I watched the two of you just now. The way he angled toward you when he came in. The way you knew what he was going to say before he finished saying it." She paused. "I've been here 4 days. I can see it from 4 days. I imagine it's been visible considerably longer to the people who live here." Rowan set her pencil down with more care than was necessary. "It's a working relationship. We've been solving problems together for 6 weeks. That's not what that was." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the yard with the dry, cutting quality it got in late November. "He wrote you a letter," Rowan said. "He made an arrangement." "He wrote that letter 2 months ago," Eleanor said, "before you arrived." She folded her hands on the table, and her expression was the expression of a woman who has assessed a situation clearly and made a decision about it. "I came a long way to be here, Miss Hale, and I'll tell you what I found when I arrived. A man who is kind and hardworking and decent, and who is also entirely, obviously, somewhere else every time he looks at you." She paused. "I'm not going to build a life on that foundation. I have too much sense." Rowan looked at the window. The fields were brown and cold and real. "He hasn't said anything," she said, and she heard how thin that sounded even as she said it. "Men like him don't say things," Eleanor said. "They show them, over and over, and wait to see if anyone notices." She picked up the pen again. "He notices everything about you. If you haven't seen it, you haven't been looking." She went back to writing the fair copy, and Rowan sat across from her and looked at the supply list and didn't see a word of it. Eleanor told Silas herself 2 days later. Rowan wasn't there for it. She was in the north field checking the channel flow when it happened. And when she came back to the house, Eleanor was in the parlor with her trunk and her traveling case in a neat stack by the door. And Silas was in the kitchen, standing at the window with his back to the room and his hands flat on the counter. "She's arranged a room in town," Calhoun said quietly, appearing at Rowan's elbow from wherever Calhoun materialized when things were happening. "Stage comes through in the morning. She says she has a cousin in Bismarck she'd planned to visit anyway." Rowan looked at Silas's back. He hadn't moved. "Did he?" she started. "He didn't ask her to stay," Calhoun said. "That's all I know." He paused. "That's all I needed to know." Eleanor came out of the parlor and saw Rowan in the hallway and stopped. The two women looked at each other. "He's going to need someone to tell him that things being complicated doesn't mean they're impossible," Eleanor said quietly. "He tends to decide complicated means impossible. It's a habit." "I know," Rowan said. "Good." Eleanor looked at her for a moment longer with the clear, assessing look she seemed to apply to everything. "You're exactly right for this place. I could see that from the road." She picked up her smaller case. "I'll see myself to the guest room." She moved past Rowan up the stairs, and Rowan stood in the hallway looking at the kitchen, where Silas still hadn't moved from the window. She went in. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the counter near his hands, and took the other one to the table and sat down. She didn't say anything. She just drank her coffee and let the room be what it was. After a while, he picked up the cup. "She told me she could see I was elsewhere," he said, still looking out the window. "She told me the same thing," Rowan said. A pause. "She's not wrong." Rowan looked at her coffee cup. "No." The silence stretched out and then folded back into something manageable. Outside, the last light was going out of the day, and the fields turned gray and then dark, and the house held the warmth that had been accumulating all day against the cold pressing in from outside. "I don't know how to do this," Silas said. He said it to the window, not to her. "I've spent a long time being careful. Not starting things I couldn't finish. Not wanting things that were going to—" He stopped. "Going to what?" she said. He turned around. He looked at her, and his expression was the open one. Fully open this time, without the partial closure she'd learned to read around the edges of it. It was the expression of a man who had run out of the energy required to keep things arranged in the more comfortable way. "Leave," he said. The word sat between them with the weight of everything it was carrying. She understood then, more fully than she had before, what Cross had done when he'd said what he'd said about Silas's wife. He'd found the exact place where Silas kept the thing most likely to make him stop, and he'd pressed on it deliberately because men like Cross understood that the fastest way to neutralize a threat is to find the fear underneath the strength and give it a voice. "I'm not your wife," Rowan said. "I'm not Eleanor Marsh. I'm not a mistake that needs correcting or an arrangement that needs sorting out." She set her cup down. "I let the stage go. I signed the contract. I dug mud out of a frozen channel for 2 weeks. None of that was an accident." He looked at her. "I know," he said quietly. "Then stop treating the future like it's already gone wrong." The lamp on the table moved in some small draft, and his face was in partial shadow, and she could see him working through something. The same painstaking way he worked through anything that mattered, not fast, not impulsive, but real. "Okay," he said. It was not a dramatic word. It was not a declaration. It was just a man saying the one syllable that meant he'd decided to stop doing the thing that was hurting him, and for Silas Boone, she'd come to understand, that was about as close to a speech as he was likely to make. She picked up her coffee cup. "The east pasture fence needs the new post sunk before the ground freezes any harder," she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Early. I'll be up." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and they finished the coffee in the ordinary quiet of two people who no longer needed to perform anything for each other. And that was its own particular thing, the best kind of thing, the kind that doesn't announce itself. What happened next didn't come from Cross directly. That was the part she hadn't anticipated. It came from Fells, the county administrator, the thin man with the leather case, who filed an administrative complaint with the Territory Land Office 2 weeks after his visit, claiming procedural irregularities in the Boone Properties employment contract. It was a technical challenge, narrow and specific, the kind of thing designed not necessarily to win but to create delay and uncertainty and cost, which was its own form of pressure. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Silas read it and handed it to Rowan without expression. She read it twice. He's not challenging the contract directly. He's challenging the filing procedure, claiming the witness attestation didn't meet territorial requirements. "Does it hold?" Silas asked. "I don't know territorial employment law well enough to say." She set the letter down. "Your lawyer in Bismarck would know." "I'll write in the morning. Take the letter and the original contract copy. And take the land assessment letter, too. The one with the non-standard valuation language. If Cross is using Fells to file administrative actions, it's worth establishing a pattern of behavior before this goes any further." Silas looked at her. "You're thinking about this like it might get worse before it gets better. I'm thinking about it like a person who watched Gideon Cross walk into this house and put his hat on someone else's side table," she said. "He's careful. He's patient. He's been acquiring land in this county for 3 years using methods that are technically defensible but consistently work in his favor." She paused. "The irrigation assessment, the Harlan property, now this. That's not a coincidence. That's a strategy." Silas was quiet for a moment, the particular thinking quiet. "The Harlan property," he said. "Ben Harlan would know what the assessment said and what he was told it meant. He's in town, runs the livery now. If he'd be willing to speak to it. He might. He's been bitter about that sale for 2 years. He folded the letter. "And there's Aldous Pratt. He's been doing land and water work in this county for 40 years. He'd know if the assessment language Cross used is a pattern across multiple properties." Rowan looked at the table. The pieces of it were coming together the way pieces do when you've been looking at a problem from the right angle. Not all at once, but steadily, each one finding its place. "You'd need to document it," she said. "Signed statements, recorded dates, something a territorial court could look at and follow." "That takes time." "Cross is counting on it taking time," she said. "He's counting on the work being harder than you have resources for. He thinks if he can keep you occupied with administrative challenges and legal costs, eventually the easier path is to sell." Silas looked at the letter on the table. Then he looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was the opposite of the closed shutter. It was the look of a man who has been trying to hold a position alone for a long time and has finally understood that he doesn't have to. I need you to come with me to Bismarck, he said. You're better at organizing this kind of information than I am. You'll see the shape of it faster. When? Thursday. It's a 2-day ride if we leave early. I'll be ready, she said. He nodded. He picked up the letter and folded it and put it in his coat pocket, and he went to get Foster to tell him about the morning chores, and Rowan sat at the table and looked at the window where the fields were white at the edges with the first real snow. She sat there for a long time, not reviewing supply lists or irrigation plans or legal documents, just sitting with the specific and unfamiliar feeling of being somewhere that needed her in ways she hadn't expected and was beginning, cautiously, imperfectly, to trust. They were 3 days out from Bismarck when it happened, and it happened the way important things tend to happen, not in the middle of the crisis they'd been preparing for, but in a quiet moment on the edge of it. They'd stopped for the night at a way station, a rough-hewn structure with a fireplace and a keeper who provided meals for travelers and asked no questions. And after supper, they sat by the fire with the documents spread between them on the bench. The assessment letters, the contract, the notes Rowan had drafted from Silas's conversations with Ben Harlan and Aldous Pratt, who had both, as it turned out, been willing to talk at length. Rowan was reading through Pratt's statement when she realized Silas wasn't looking at the papers. She looked up. He was watching her with the open expression, the fully open one. "What?" she said. "I keep thinking about what you said," he said, "about not treating the future like it's already gone wrong." She waited. "I've been doing that my whole life," he said. "Every time something started to matter, I'd already be halfway to deciding it wasn't going to work. Started protecting myself from the loss before the thing was even lost." He looked at the fire. "I did it with the ranch. Did it with—" He stopped. "I did it with my wife. I was so certain something was going to go wrong that I kept enough of myself held back that eventually she didn't see a reason to stay. And I told myself that proved I'd been right." "Mo dapasimkos." Rowan set the paper down. "You weren't right," she said. "No." He looked back at her. "I was just early." The fire moved between them, and outside the way station the Dakota dark was absolute. No moon, no wind, just the cold pressing against the walls and the warmth holding inside. And she had the feeling of being at the center of something, the still point of a thing still in motion. "I'm not going to do that again," he said. "I'm telling you that. I don't know what the right words are. I never have. But I'm telling you, I'm not going to do it again." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said, and then, "I'm not going anywhere, Silas." He held her look, and something in his face shifted the way the land had shifted when the water first ran through the channel. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that was real and permanent. "Okay," he said, the same one syllable as before. She picked up Pratt's statement and went back to reading, and he turned to the assessment letter, and outside the stars were hidden behind the cloud cover. And the cold was doing what Dakota cold does in November, and inside the way station the fire held its ground, and the two of them worked through the documents side by side until the keeper banked the fire for the night and they went separately to sleep. But something had been said, and something had been heard, and in the morning when they rode out toward Bismarck the cold was the same, and the road was the same, and everything looked identical to the day before, except that it wasn't. Not quite, not anymore. And they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. What Rowan didn't know, and wouldn't know until they were already riding back, was that the morning after they left for Bismarck, she had left a lamp burning in the kitchen window. She hadn't meant to. She'd left in the dark, before the house was properly awake. And she'd been moving quickly, and the lamp had still been lit from the night before, and she'd simply forgotten. When they came back 4 days later, the lamp was out. Foster had seen to it. But Calhoun told her about it quietly, the evening they returned over coffee at the kitchen table. "Silas saw it when we rode out," he said, "the light in the window." Rowan looked at the lamp on the table. "He didn't say anything," Calhoun continued. "He just looked at it, for a moment." He turned his cup in his hands. "I haven't seen him look at this house that way in a long time." She didn't answer. There wasn't anything to say that the silence didn't already hold. Outside, the snow that had been threatening for a week finally came, falling soft and steady across the fields, and the water ran through the channels beneath it, and the house held its warmth, and somewhere in the barn, Silas was doing the last check of the evening with his lantern moving through the dark in the particular way she'd come to know from the kitchen window, steady, unhurried, the same every night. She watched the light move and then she went to bed, and she did not think about leaving. The Bismarck trip had gone better than either of them had the right to expect. Martin Lowe, Calhoun's old friend, the lawyer, had spent 2 hours with the documents spread across his desk, and at the end of it sat back in his chair and looked at Silas over his reading glasses with the expression of a man who has seen a pattern he recognizes. 3 properties in 18 months, he said. Same assessor, same non-standard valuation language, same outcome. Seller accepts a price significantly below actual yield potential. He tapped Pratt's signed statement. Aldous Pratt's testimony is solid. He's been in this county longer than Cross has been alive, and he has no reason to misrepresent standard practice. He looked at Rowan. You organized this. Silas gathered the statements, she said. She organized it, Silas said. Lowe looked between them with the brief, perceptive look of a man who notices things outside the documents as readily as things within them, and then he went back to the papers. I can file a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Commission on the basis of this evidence. It won't move fast. These things never do. But once it's filed, any further administrative actions Cross initiates through county channels will be subject to review under the complaint. He paused. It also means Cross knows he's being watched. Men who operate the way he operates tend to become more careful when they know they're being watched. Will it stop him? Silas asked. It'll slow him down considerably, and it'll protect your property during the process. Lowe looked at Rowan again. The employment contract is solid, by the way. Whatever Fells claimed about attestation procedure, he was wrong or lying, which in my experience amounts to the same thing. They rode back to the ranch with the complaint filed and Lowe's written confirmation in Silas's coat pocket, and the relief of it was real but quiet. Not triumph, just the particular settling that happens when a thing you've been bracing against loses some of its teeth. But December came in hard, the way Dakota Decembers do, without apology. The ranch pulled inward the way it did every winter. Work compressed into the daylight hours, evenings around the kitchen lamp, the distances between tasks shrinking as the cold made the world smaller. Foster came less frequently as the weather worsened, and more of the daily work fell to the two of them, and Calhoun took on the indoor tasks that his joints would allow and stayed out of the cold with the pragmatic self-knowledge of a man who understood his own limits. It was a good winter, in the way that hard things can be good. Not comfortable, not easy, but full. Full of work and purpose, and the particular rhythm of two people who had stopped performing anything for each other and were simply present in the shared life they'd built without entirely meaning to. Rowan noticed things she hadn't let herself notice before. The way Silas remembered, without being told, that she took her coffee without sugar. The way he set tools back exactly where she'd left them, which was never where they were supposed to go according to the barn's original organization, but always where she'd find them fastest. The way he listened, actually listened, the full attention kind, when she was working through a problem out loud, not waiting for her to finish so he could respond, but following the thread of her thinking in real time. She noticed the way he looked at the fields on cold mornings, not with the anxious assessment of a man calculating what might go wrong, but with something quieter, something that had more patience in it than it used to. She thought about what Eleanor had said. He shows things, over and over, and waits to see if anyone notices. She had been noticing for weeks. She suspected he knew it. The night it finally came to a point was an ordinary Thursday in December, with the temperature somewhere below useful and the snow coming sideways off the north. And Silas had been out half the afternoon reinforcing the barn walls against a gap the wind had found in the northeast corner. He came in after dark, cold to the bone, and she had supper on and coffee ready, and said nothing about the fact that he'd been out there 2 hours longer than he should have been in that wind, because he was a grown man who could make his own decisions about frostbite. He sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, and she put food in front of him and sat across from him, and Calhoun was already in bed because he'd been going to bed earlier and earlier as the winter deepened. They ate in the quiet that was normal between them now, the good kind of quiet. Then Silas set his fork down and looked at her and said, I want to ask you something, and I need you to not be practical about it for a minute. She looked at him. That's a significant request. I know. She set her own fork down. All right. He looked at the table and then at her, and she could see the effort it took. Not the effort of saying something untrue, but the effort of saying something true out loud, which is harder. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as the ranch manager, not under a contract." He paused. "I want to marry you. If you want that, if you—" He stopped. "I'm not good at this. I know I'm not good at this." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, this man who worked methodically and listened carefully and had spent years protecting himself from loss by deciding in advance that everything was already lost. This imperfect, guarded, decent man who had just said the most unguarded thing she'd ever heard him say. "You're doing all right," she said. "Rowan." "Yes," she said, "I want that." He looked at her for a moment as if verifying it, and she held his look steadily so there was nothing ambiguous in it to misread. "Okay," he said. She almost laughed. "You're going to say okay to everything, aren't you?" "Probably," he said. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the thing that lives next door to one. "Is that a problem?" "Ask me in 10 years, she said. He reached across the table and his hand covered hers on the tabletop. And it was not a dramatic gesture, it was just a hand, large and rough from years of work, resting over hers with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had decided to stop holding back. They stayed that way for a while, and the snow came against the windows, and the lamp held its light. They married in February at the courthouse in Caldwell Ford, with Calhoun as witness and Foster standing in the back of the room in his good shirt looking uncomfortable and pleased in equal measure. Mercer from the dry goods store came without being invited, claimed he'd been in the building on other business, and stayed for the whole thing. 3 other ranchers showed up, which neither of them had expected. It was not a long ceremony. It was not a particularly elegant one. Rowan wore the better of her 2 dresses, and Silas had a jacket she hadn't seen before that fit him almost right. And they stood in front of the county judge and said the words and signed the register, and that was that. On the ride back to the ranch, with the snow packed hard on the road and the horses moving in the cold, Calhoun said from the back of the wagon, "Your grandmother would have liked her." Silas said nothing. She would have said something like, "She walks the land the right way." He paused. "Which is not a small thing where we come from." Rowan looked at the fields on either side of the road, white and flat and silent under February, with the stubble of last autumn's crop pressing up through the snow. In 4 months, those fields would be turning. In 5, the water would be running at full pressure through the rebuilt channels. In 6, there would be a crop in the ground that had a real chance of coming in the way this land was capable of producing, if someone knew what it needed. She knew what it needed. The Land Commission complaint moved through its process with the grinding slowness that Lowe had promised, and Cross was careful in exactly the way Lowe had predicted careful men become when they know they're being watched. He made no further administrative filings. He sent no more representatives with leather cases. He was present in town occasionally. They saw him twice that winter in Caldwell Ford. And he was cordial in the surface way he'd always been cordial. And whatever he thought about how things had resolved, he kept in the part of his mind where he kept everything important. In April, the Territorial Land Commission ruled that the assessment methodology Cross had used on 3 properties constituted unfair practice under territorial statutes. He was required to provide compensatory payments to the affected sellers, including Ben Harlan, and barred from using county-affiliated assessors for a period of 5 years. He didn't lose everything. Men like Cross rarely do. But he lost enough, and the loss was public enough, that the particular strategy he'd been using in this county was finished. Martin Lowe sent the ruling by post. Silas read it at the kitchen table and handed it across to Rowan and said nothing. She read it. Then she set it down. "Harlan gets compensated," she said. "Yes." "Good." She pushed the letter back toward him. "File that with the contract documents." He filed it. Life moved on. Calhoun died in June, on a warm morning with the windows open and the smell of the fields coming through, in his own bed, at the age of 79. He'd been slowing down since March in the way of someone who has made a private decision about timing, and he went without drama and without apparent struggle, which was entirely consistent with how he'd done everything else. He left Silas a letter. Silas read it alone and didn't tell her what it said, and she didn't ask. Some things are meant only for the people they're meant for. What she knew was that for 2 days after, Silas was quieter than usual, and she let the quiet be what it needed to be. And on the third evening, she came and sat next to him on the porch, and he put his arm around her and they watched the light go out of the fields. And that was what grief looks like when two people share it without needing to perform it. She missed Calhoun in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. She missed his pale blue eyes that saw things before they happened. She missed the way he held his coffee cup in both hands. She missed the particular satisfaction he'd shown on the morning she'd walked back to the house with Silas carrying her trunk. The face of a man watching something he'd expected finally arrive. She thought about him often when she walked the property. She thought he would have liked what the fields looked like that summer. The harvest that first full year was the best the Boone property had produced in a decade. Silas knew the numbers from his father's records, and when the final tally came in, he sat with it for a long time without saying anything, which she recognized by now as his way of absorbing things that mattered. "The north field alone," he said finally. "The irrigation," she said. "The irrigation," he agreed. "And everything else." The neighboring ranchers noticed. They couldn't help noticing. A property that had been visibly struggling for years didn't nearly double its yield without people asking questions. Some of them came to ask, which was its own kind of acknowledgement, the kind that people in that part of the country offered instead of compliments because compliments didn't come easily. Tom Aldrich from the East Boundary came to look at the channel system and stayed 3 hours. The Prewitt family from 6 miles north sent their eldest son with a set of questions about the gravel lining method that Rowan answered in detail and then followed up with a hand-drawn diagram, because if the information was useful, it was more useful shared. Mercer, the next time she came into the dry goods store, spoke to her directly. Not to Silas standing next to her, not to some point in the middle distance, directly at her, like a person talking to another person. It was a small thing. She didn't make anything of it out loud, but she noticed, and she let it mean what it meant. She got a letter from Ohio in August, from her brother, the one who'd inherited their father's land. He was cordial in the stiff way of someone who suspects they've behaved poorly and has no intention of addressing it directly. He mentioned the farm, mentioned some difficulty with the eastern field's drainage, and at the end, almost as an afterthought, said he hoped she'd found a satisfactory situation. She wrote back. She told him she had. She told him about the ranch, the irrigation work, the harvest numbers, briefly and without embellishment. She told him about the drainage fix if he wanted the specifics, which he could use or not as he saw fit. She didn't tell him that satisfactory was not the right word for what she'd found. There was no word for it that would have meant anything to him. You couldn't explain in a letter what it felt like to walk land that needed what you knew how to give it, to wake up in the morning with a clear purpose and the tools to pursue it, to be seen, actually seen, by someone who understood that who you were and what you could do were not two separate things but the same thing, continuous. You couldn't explain that either, not in a letter. She sealed it and gave it to Foster to take to town and went back to the East Field, where Silas was working on the secondary distribution channel that they'd roughed in during spring and were now finishing properly. He looked up when she came over the rise. "Letter from Ohio?" he said. "How did you know?" "You had the expression you get when something from the past shows up." She looked at him. "I have an expression for that?" "You do." He went back to the channel work. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," she said. She picked up the other spade and dropped down into the trench beside him. "He's having trouble with his east field drainage." I gave him the method." Silas glanced at her. Generous. "It's just information," she said. "Information doesn't cost anything to give away." He said nothing, which was agreement, and they worked together in the warm August afternoon with the sound of the creek carrying from the north and the fields full and green on either side of the trench. And the sky was the particular blue it gets over Dakota in late summer, wide and deep and certain. There is something that people misunderstand about belonging somewhere. They think it's a feeling that arrives when you get to the right place, some internal signal, a click, a recognition. They talk about it as though belonging is a thing a place gives you, like weather or soil quality, something that exists independently of what you put into it. Rowan had thought that too once. She'd thought the arrangement with Cross would give her belonging, a name, a deed. A defined place in a defined structure. Something decided in advance, clean and clear. What she understood now, standing in her own field with mud on her boots and a husband who spoke mostly in silences she'd learned to read, and a harvest coming in that her own hands had helped make possible, was that belonging is not something you receive. It is something you build slowly out of the actual material of your actual days. The problems you solve, the work you do well and the work you do badly and do again, the people you stay for, the mornings you choose. She had chosen this morning, and the one before it, and the one before that. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. But their daughter was born in March, 3 years after Rowan had stepped off a stagecoach at the wrong address. They named her Clara, which had been Calhoun's mother's name. Silas had mentioned it once, briefly, and she'd remembered. Clara Boone was a quiet baby who became a watchful child, and by the time she was 4, she had a habit that made Silas look at Rowan with an expression she'd come to love. The combination of recognition and something close to wonder. The child walked the fields, not playing, not running, walking with the deliberate, observant attention of someone looking at something that needed to be understood. She would crouch at the channel edge, the way Rowan had crouched on her first morning, put her small hand in the soil, look at what came up. She would stand at the edge of the pasture in the early morning and look at the grass and the fence line and the sky with an expression that was ancient in a face that young. One morning, Rowan came out to find her standing at the south channel, studying the water level, her boots already muddy at the toe from stepping closer than she should have. "What are you looking at?" Rowan asked, crouching beside her. Clara pointed at the water line. "It's lower than yesterday." Rowan looked. She was right, maybe an inch lower. "Good eye. What do you think that means?" Clara thought about it with the serious consideration she gave most things. Something's blocking it? Maybe. Or the intake needs adjusting. We'll check it this afternoon. Can I come? "Yes," Rowan said. "You can come." She took the small muddy hand and they walked back to the house together through the morning light, and behind them the water ran through the channel that Rowan had helped build from a silted, failed thing into something that worked, that actually worked, season after season, the way things work when they're built right for the right reasons. Silas was on the porch with his coffee, watching them come up from the fields. He had the open expression, her favorite of his expressions, the one that had taken months to earn the full version of. "South Channel's down an inch," Rowan said. "I'll look at the intake before breakfast." Clara found it. He looked at his daughter with the recognition and wonder expression, and Clara looked back at him with the serious watchfulness she'd been born with, and something passed between them, father and daughter, that was made of the same material as everything else on this property. Work and attention, and the accumulated weight of choosing to be here every day, over and over. Rowan went inside to finish the coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and watched Silas come off the porch and crouch down to Clara's level and say something, and Clara's face shifted, still serious, but lit underneath, and they walked together toward the south channel, the tall man and the small child, moving through the morning in the particular way of people who know exactly where they're going and why. This was not the life she had arranged. It was not what she'd been sent to find, not what anyone had planned or predicted or promised. It was better than all of that. It was real. And the land, the dark, deep, patient land, held them the way good land holds everything that belongs to it, without ceremony, without fanfare, simply and permanently, as if it had always known they were coming.